Hello, folks. Some of you are looking at me right now, and because, well, we're going live with the video thing. We're going to give this a shot. We're going to see how it goes. I was once told by a very wise man that the first time you do something should never be the best. So my guess is that this is going to suck, and you can not watch it, and you can just listen to it, and maybe you'll be better off for doing that. I don't know. But here we go. With a warm intro, as I said, we're going to start doing the whiskey portion here at the beginning. And so what are we drinking? Well, as promised, if you can see, this is Glendalough, a Irish whiskey. I don't know if that was backwards or not. We'll see. It says, the man on our bottle, St. Kevin, stood apart, and this whiskey does the same. This quintessentially Irish style of whiskey, pot still, is first matured in American oak ex-bourbon casks. It is then matured in Irish oak casks made from trees felled in the mountains around the distillery. While the bourbon casks soften and sweeten the whiskey, the higher levels of flavor in the Irish oak casks complement and balance the classic pot still spices. Let me tell you, this is not a terribly expensive whiskey. As I have said recently, I'm kind of getting into the whole Irish whiskey thing, and this is a really tasty one. I'm really a big fan of it. So yeah, go out there, give it a shot. I think you're going to like it if you're a whiskey drinker. And hey, I told you we were going to do this before, so maybe you're drinking whiskey with me. The Glendalough, we'll see. I haven't had anything yet, so we'll just take a little quick sip here. Slancha, as they say in Ireland. As I've said before, I drink my whiskey neat most of the time. Every once in a while, I do like a old-fashioned, but generally speaking, I'm going to drink it neat, just like this. And this glass actually was given to me by a good friend who is in Tennessee currently. But regardless, here we go. Listen, today, this is sort of part 2 of the episode 1 of season 2, which was all about cessationism, and we looked at Why I Am a Cessationist, the article from Thomas Schreiner, whose name I continually screwed up during that episode. And today, what we're going to do is we've pulled an essay out of a book of a collection of essays from C.S. Lewis called God in the Dock, and this essay is called Miracles. And I hold here in my hands I hold in my hands a copy of the essay called Miracles from C.S. Lewis's God in the Dock. So what we're going to do today is we're going to kind of lean into this a little bit. We'll talk about miracles. And listen, just maybe on a more personal note, it took me a while to get to recording this. I thought I was going to record it pretty much immediately after I made an 8 dinner the last time around, but this is a hard one to get to for a number of reasons, and maybe partially because it was just kind of hard to think about or talk about miracles. So anyway, that's it. Here we go. We're going to finish up with the warm intro. Believe it or not, we really will. And when I see you on the other side, we're going to be talking through C.S. Lewis's essay on miracles. Hey, how we doing? Welcome once again to Jesus Whiskey and Question Marks. As I said, this is season 2, episode 2, where we are going to talk about miracles, sort of the flip side of the last conversation where we talked about cessationism. We're going to talk about the lack of cessationism, or continuation is what they call it, I think more officially theologically. And we're pulling from the essay from C.S. Lewis, just entitled Miracles. I highly recommend God in the Dock. It is a collection of essays from C.S. Lewis that's been put together. It's really fantastic. And what I love about C.S. Lewis is that I feel like when I'm reading his stuff, every once in a while it's like, okay, I totally get this. This is really great. It's kind of on my level. But then I will also, almost in the same breath, in the same piece that he's written, I'm like, man, I got to read this like again, because I don't fully understand what it was that he just said. And so I kind of go back and take a look and see where things are. But anyway, look, I want to kind of go back and reiterate this statement that he makes, and it's really pretty early on. It's like the end of the first paragraph in this essay on miracles. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, "Experience proves this or that or nothing according to the preconceptions we bring to it." Right? So the idea here essentially is that experiences are important. They are valid things, but they are going to, our experiences themselves and how we interpret them are going to be affected by the preconceptions that we bring to them, right? And so I'm going to quote or at least talk pretty heavily about this article and the things that he has to say in it. And so playing off of this experience proves this or that or nothing based off of or according to the preconceptions you bring to it. He opens telling the story about he basically says seeing is not believing. He says this is the first thing to get clear in talking about miracles. Whatever experience we may have, we shall not regard them as miraculous if we already hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural. So if we were to go back to the article on cessationism from Thomas Schreiner, I don't know anything about Thomas Schreiner. I don't know how he grew up. I don't know really anything other than he wrote this article for the Gospel Coalition in actually 2014. So we're now 10 to 11 years past when he wrote this article. But my suspicion is that there is a high likelihood that his experiences and how he grew up deeply impacted his philosophy and his ideas when it comes specifically to the idea of miracles. And so what we have to do is really recognize that however we feel about miracles, our experiences probably play into that, or how we got to where we're at. And so should we see a miracle, whether or not we would interpret it as such is probably predetermined by our preconceptions, at least to some degree. There's a heavy influence that our preconceptions are going to have when it comes to that. So one of the interesting things he says, we can always say we have been the victim of an illusion. If we disbelieve in the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. Hence, whether miracles have really ceased or not, they would certainly appear to cease in Western Europe, where he is writing this, or in America here, as materialism became the popular creed. And so when he talks about materialism, he's talking about more specifically sort of the atheistic point of view that if I can't hold it in my hands, then it doesn't exist, right? And I think this is part of the problem that we face in Western Christianity, is that we have this challenge where the reality of the situation is that if I get a headache, or if I start to get a headache, my predisposition is to reach for a bottle of something that I know, some sort of medication that I know is going to help to relieve that headache, right? It's less likely, in fact, it's quite unlikely, that I'm going to start by praying, dear God, just let's not do this headache thing. Can we not do the headache thing? And so what's important to recognize is that our experience and where we live and how we grew up is absolutely going to have a dictatorial effect on how we perceive things that could or may be miraculous, if you will. So in that way, experience, and this is kind of what he says here, experience by itself, it doesn't really prove anything. If somebody doubts what he kind of talks about, if you doubt whether or not you're dreaming or you're awake, there's no experience or experiment that can solve this doubt, because every experiment could actually be a part of that dream, right? So you think about if you're having a dream and you're wondering whether or not it's a dream, and there's some experiment that we do to find out whether or not it is a dream, well, is the experiment a part of the dream? And so that experience of whatever comes out of that experience may be completely worthless for that reason alone. I think one of the things that we have to recognize as well is above all else, humans tend to believe the stories that we tell ourselves. And so if we look at it, this is another quote from him. He says, "I think that just as our preconceptions would prevent us from apprehending miracles if they really occurred, preconceptions would also lead one to imagine miracles even if they did not occur." Right? So the flip side is true as well, is if I've seen something that I perceived as miraculous, then or if I'm preconditioned to believe that miracles happen, then something that happens that seems to be miraculous, I'm going to point to and say that was a miracle. And where he's going to go with this is actually quite brilliant, because he kind of blows this whole preconception thing up and goes, hey, listen, there are things that we consider ordinary that are actually quite miraculous. And therefore, we have to really reconsider how we look at some of these things. And he talks a little bit about how there's I don't remember exactly how I like to put this, but there is this idea, this sort of arrogance of progress, if you will, that I think there's actually a name for it, and forgive me, I don't have it in front of me, but there's this idea that wherever you're at historically is the pinnacle of everything, right? So this idea is that here today in 2025, society or any civilization that has ever existed on the planet that we call Earth has never been as technologically advanced or as intelligent, had the mental acuity that we do today. And because of this, what I like to call scientific arrogance, I guess to some degree, we tend to point back to other times in known history and talk about how stupid the people were, right? And you see this kind of all over the place. And frankly, like, I'm not going to go down this road today, but I will go eventually down this road a little bit. The idea that like all of these little g gods that everybody believed in, thousands of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, were all just made up because all of society, all the civilizations that existed on the planet were just too stupid to acknowledge or recognize a true force, a natural force, something in nature that sort of naturally occurs. They were too dumb to recognize those things. And he addresses this pretty quickly. He says, there's one thing often said about our ancestors which we must not say. We must not say that they believed in miracles because they did not know the laws of nature. He just flat out says this is nonsense. We have to recognize that, like, the only way, and he does such a beautiful job of talking about this, but the only way to recognize that something is miraculous is because we have some knowledge of the non-miraculous or the more traditional laws of nature. So this is this conversation. He says that if we regard something as a miracle precisely because we know enough of the laws of nature to know that this is a suspension of them. When the disciples saw Christ walking on the water, they were frightened. They would not have been frightened if they didn't know that the laws of nature do not allow for somebody to walk on the surface of water, right? So the arrogance of us to say, well, they were just a bunch of idiots or a bunch of hicks or whatever we want to say, it actually doesn't work, right? Because they have to know that there is a law of nature to know that that law has been suspended. And if somebody has no conception of the regular order in nature, then he could not notice departures in that order, right? So for us to say they just didn't know the laws of nature and that's why they perceived everything to be miraculous is just, it's ridiculous. As Lewis says, it's nonsense. And he goes on to talk about, like, generally speaking, he says nothing is wonderful except the abnormal, and nothing is abnormal until we have grasped the norm. So a complete ignorance or a complete just disregard or lack of knowledge as it comes to the laws of nature would preclude and it would negate the perception of anything miraculous. And so we have to be able to shut off that part of us that says, well, these were just a bunch of idiots that didn't know what they were actually talking about. And because frankly, here's the thing, if somebody was completely ignorant of the laws of nature, the laws of science, the laws of physics, then he would completely ignore any abnormality or anything that occurred outside of those laws. This is Lewis's point, and we go back to Jesus walking on water and that miraculous event, right? If we didn't otherwise know that you could not walk on water, then that would not be miraculous. If we didn't otherwise know that you can't, whatever action, physical action Jesus took that turned barrels of water into wine, if we didn't know that like that just doesn't normally happen, then it would not be miraculous, right? If people were raising from the dead all of the time, then there would be nothing miraculous about Jesus raising from the dead, right? So it's the knowledge that some things exist and some things don't that allows us to be able to even acknowledge that miracles ever did happen, right? And we have to be clear that cessationists are not saying that miracles never happened. They're just saying, well, they don't happen now. And that's where I go back to what I said earlier about this idea of like, if I'm starting to get a headache, I'm not immediately going for the miraculous sort of way of solving that headache problem, right? What I'm going for is the real life sciencey version of a solution to that problem, and I actually remove the possibility of a miracle. And so my argument against cessationism is how much of it is that the things don't happen anymore versus we don't provide an opportunity for those things to happen anymore because we think we've got things figured out in a better way. And then we go and we say things like, well, God gave us the knowledge to be able to do these things, which I don't disagree with, but I don't think that God gave us the knowledge of creating ibuprofen or Excedrin migraine. Although, I mean, I do think he gave us that knowledge for that because Excedrin migraine sometimes is all that works for me. But I don't think he gave us that knowledge so that we could be wholly reliant on a plastic bottle of pills rather than on him, right? And as Christians, we should hold really both beliefs, right? Modern, both beliefs. So first world culture has elevated the natural and crept in and de-emphasized the beyond nature. And this is exactly what I'm talking about with the whole headache thing, right? So we have emphasized the natural, the things that we are able to do. And let's quickly define natural and supernatural because it's actually a lot easier than most people give it credit for. There is only one thing that is actually supernatural. And there are people that are going to disagree with me on this, but logically, I can't find a way that there is anything beyond one thing that is supernatural. And the thing that is supernatural is the thing that created all natural things, which is Yahweh himself, the Godhead, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. That is the only thing that is supernatural, that is outside of the natural world, because he created the natural world, which means everything that he created is a part of the natural world. Our perception of things that are beyond what we see as natural does not make them supernatural. It just makes them bigger or different or outside of our realm of perception. And I think there's a whole avenue that we can go that makes things a little bit crazy there. But regardless, God is supernatural. Everything else is a part of the natural order that he created and must exist within the laws of the natural world that he created. So when we emphasize the things that are natural In other words, I can go and take a pharmaceutical to fix my problem, which, again, I'm not necessarily blanket statement pharmaceuticals are bad, whether it's ibuprofen, Excedrin, or I don't know, name it, manufactured insulin for the diabetic, or there are so many different things that pharmaceuticals that people take for really great reasons. I'm not saying that those are bad. What I am saying is that our ability to create those does not negate the fact that God can still perform miraculous things and still does perform miraculous things. And our saying that God gave us the ability to create these things that exist within the natural world does not mean that he's like, so quit relying on me. In fact, it is our insistence to rely on the natural, the things that we feel like we have created, whether he gave us the ability or the power to create those or not. And there's a whole nother conversation to be said about that. But none of that takes away from the fact that what he wants and what we actually really deeply need within ourselves is a total and complete reliance on Yahweh. And that's a bit of a picture of Jesus and the fact that he had to come to earth and do what he did, die for us, because we were completely incapable of bringing ourselves into a right relationship with the Father. So let's just keep that in mind as we move forward here. Lewis talks about, and Schreiner talks about this as well. He when he starts talking about miracles, he's like, look, miraculous. Remember this, miraculous things happen in third world countries or whatever. And he says, no doubt, this is Lewis here, no doubt most stories of miracles are unreliable. But then, as anyone can see by reading the papers, so are most stories of all events. Each story must be taken on its merits. What one must not do... Okay, I'm going to hold on that for a second. Let's take the American experiment over the last 5 years, okay? I am 45 years old, and for 40 years leading up to the last 5 years, it was crazy, and then it got even crazier, right? People were questioning the media, and when I say the media, what I mean is news media specifically, regardless of what political side of the aisle you were on, right? The political left would question the reliability of Fox News. The political right would question the reliability of CNN. And like we could vomit all of the things that really bother us about the news media on whichever side you want to go to, right? I can come up with 1,000 different names of media agencies that people don't trust because they don't align with their political viewpoint, okay? That's what he's saying here in the 40s, all right? Most stories of miracles are unreliable, but then, as anyone can see by reading the papers, so are most stories of all events. Each story must be taken on its merits. Now, here's the important thing, and here's the thing that really shuts down people who want to say either miracles don't happen or never happened. What one must not do is to rule out the supernatural as the one impossible explanation. Okay? So, like, I'm here with this. I'm 100% with him on this. You're telling me that anything is possible except the miraculous. Like, help me understand that. Why is this the one thing that cannot be true? And what's absolutely insane about this is that it's not unbelievers exclusively who are like, I'm removing the miraculous, but anything else is possible, really. It's even believers do the same thing. And that's just shocking to me because we believe that the Bible tells us that all these miraculous things have happened. And where this becomes problematic specifically, right? So we're talking about like, let's go revisit this a little bit. Why did I start this podcast? What was the whole point? The whole point is that there are people who are searching for something that they cannot find. And the reason that they cannot find it is because there's an incongruency between who or what Christians say that they believe and actually believe, and even like the experiences that those people have had. So because a lot of these people have lived life in a way that maybe they experienced a real challenge, a real struggle in let's say in a church, they may be preconditioned to believe that any negative story about a church or the church is true. They may be preconditioned to believe that anything that is, quote, good or that comes positive sort of out of the church is really just pie in the sky, some dream that, or some made up thing, or people pretending that that's good or whatever the thing is, right? So we have to be able to recognize that this is a real challenge for these folks. And one thing is absolutely true. People today in 2025 are far more open to talking about things that are more, let's say, quote, spiritual in nature than they were 5-10 years ago. And when the church begins to deny that some of those things may still be currently happening, then the experiences that people have that lead to, well, this is something that feels less physical and more spiritual. That's the experience that I had. That's the only thing that makes any logical sense. There's some sort of spiritual thing here. The Christian church is denying that those things are really happening anymore because we forgot about Ephesians 6:10. So they're going to go somewhere else. They're going to go find somewhere else to validate the feelings and the experiences that they've had. And we have to remember things like the Bible doesn't say ghosts don't exist. And I maybe just lost some of you, and that's fine. We can ask me some questions. Let's have a conversation. The Bible doesn't say ghosts don't exist. The Bible says do not practice necromancy. There's a difference between those two things. In fact, if ghosts don't exist, then, or if ghosts are only ever demons, right? Which is usually what people say. Well, they're not really ghosts. They're all demons. There's a problem with that. And the problem with that is in Scripture, when Saul goes to the witch of Endor and he's like, hey, I need to talk to Samuel because I need his counsel. And Samuel is dead. It does not say that she conjured up some spirit that was not Samuel. It says that she conjured up Samuel. And Samuel is like, bro, what are you doing? I'm dead. The ghost of Samuel appears. It doesn't not appear. So the problem isn't that ghosts don't exist. The problem is, I think, side note, twofold. One, we should only be calling on God for counsel in those spaces. We don't need to be calling on our ancestors or any of those other things. And two, let's assume that we did call up some sort of a spirit. We don't know that it's not demonic or a demon. And so God's like, protect yourself, and let's not be ridiculous about this. I can help you. I'm the only person in the spiritual world who can help you, whether it's sending a messenger or the Spirit himself to speak to you. But the thing is, like, if you go through, so Lewis talks about this story that's in the Old Testament. Since the Old Testament says that Sennacherib's invasion was stopped by angels, okay? So this is 2 Kings, and so Sennacherib is coming, and his invasion is stopped by angels. Herodotus, who is another secular historian, Gentile historian, says it was stopped by a lot of mice who came up and ate all the bowstrings of his army. Now, Lewis says an open-minded man is on the side of the angels. Unless you start by begging the question, there is nothing intrinsically unlikely in the existence of angels or in the action ascribed to them. In other words, we don't know enough about angels to say that they could or couldn't do this, but it makes more sense than saying mice don't go running through camps eating the bowstrings of all of the bows. They don't do that, right? So it's very similar to this argument that there is no creator, but there was a Big Bang. The problem with that from a physics standpoint is that just basic physics, it requires some action to force the reaction of the Big Bang, which means something had to preclude the Big Bang. And they're fine with that as long as it's not God, right? So it gets so muddy. Modern people have an almost aesthetic dislike of miracles. Admitting that God can, which we do, we admit, well, yes, God can do miracles. They doubt if he would. Well, why? Why? God can, but I don't think that he would. Because it violates the laws he himself imposed on creation. Somehow, like, there's a problem, a disconnect. We don't like that God would violate the laws that he created for nature. Unless it's in the Bible, in which case we don't have any problem with the fact that God led thousands of people to a sea and then split it. No argument there. God spoke and things came into being. No argument there. So he can, but he wouldn't do that today. He would only do that in biblical times. So there's this word that he uses. It's called solicism. I think that's right. Lewis says essentially that, like, there's this sense that if we acknowledge that God would perform miracles, then somehow it's like this solicism, which is a grammatical mistake against the grammar of the universe. The other problem is that he says that people confuse the laws of nature with the laws of thought and imagine that their reversal or suspension would be a contradiction in terms, as if the resurrection of the dead were the same sort of thing as 2 and 2 making 5. Okay, so this is the idea that, like, the laws of thought are the same thing as the laws of nature. They're not, right? Just because we can't comprehend something doesn't mean it can't be. In fact, as believers in a God that we say that we believe in, our comprehension of Yahweh is lacking, to say the least. He is infinitely more than we could ever imagine. And so we have to recognize that what gets in the way of God performing a miracle is the idea that we don't like that God could perform a miracle. I'm not saying what I'm not saying is that God doesn't perform miracles because we don't like that he can. What I'm saying is that we often and very likely miss the miraculous because of us, not because God's not doing miraculous things. And he says, so Lewis basically is like, miracles are a retelling in small letters of the very same story, which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some to use. Okay, so what are we talking about here? He says the miracles, in fact, are a retelling in small letters of the very same story, which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. The idea here is that miracles that God does or Jesus does locally are a reflection of things that he has done on a much larger or more global scale, right? And there's some really awesome ways that we can see this. Not all of them, but he says some are reminders and others prophecies. But think about it this way, and this is what I was talking about earlier, that, like, the idea that some of the things that we don't recognize as miraculous are actually miraculous, okay? So let's take, for example, God creates the vine and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and with the aid of the sun to turn that water into a juice, which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year, from Noah's time till ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. But when Jesus turns water into wine at a wedding in Cana, all of a sudden everybody's like, whoa, cool. But the miracle only has half its effect if it only convinces us that Christ is God. It will have its full effect if, whenever we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine, we remember that here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. That's crazy, right? And then he goes on and he talks about the same thing happens with grain, right? So you've got this plant, this wheat that grows, and it forms this thing that we turn into bread, right? Naturally forming yeast and water. We mix the things together after we grind up the grain, and now we get bread and we bake it. Bread is not made of nothing. It's not made of stones, as the devil once suggested to our Lord in vain. But a little bread, grain, is made into much bread, right? And then Jesus says, the Son will do nothing but what he sees the Father do. So, what does Jesus do with bread? He takes 5 loaves and 2 fishes, right, and turns them into enough food for tens of thousands of people. It's insane. But it's exactly what God does when he gave us grain and the ability to turn grain into bread. And the miracles of healing fall into the same pattern. The magic is not in the medicine, but in the patient's body. What the doctor does is to stimulate nature's functions in the body or to remove hindrances. This is what that does. Ibuprofen is an anti-inflammatory. Now, there's people out there that are way smarter than me that know more pharmacology than I do, and they're going to tell me all the things that are wrong with what I just said about it. But generally speaking, it's an anti-inflammatory. So it helps to anti-inflame or de-inflame inflamed muscles and tissues, and that's what makes them feel better. The body does the work then. Though we speak for convenience of healing a cut, every cut heals itself. No dressing will make skin grow over a cut on a corpse. It's the body that does the healing, and the dressing creates an environment for that healing to take place. The same mysterious energy, which we call gravitational when it steers the planets, and biochemical when it heals a body, is the efficient cause of all recoveries. And if God exists, that energy directly or indirectly is his, and all who are cured by him. Now, this statement right here, I'm going to read it again because it actually ties exactly back to what I was saying in cessationism, the conversation on cessationism. Okay, so that same mysterious energy, which we call gravitational when it steers the planets, and biochemical when it heals a body, is the efficient cause of all recoveries. And if God exists, that energy, directly or indirectly, is his, and all who are cured are cured by him. So when we start to have this conversation about how I don't know that I believe that people are speaking in tongues anymore, or I don't believe that people are healing anybody anymore, they never did. That was God working through them to reveal himself through those people. God was always the one doing it. He gifted those people, but it was him through the Spirit gifting those people. This isn't a situation where it was like, I give you the gift to go do with it wherever you want. If somebody healed somebody, God allowed that healing to take place. He could have removed the power from that healing, which means that in that healing, there was a reason for that healing. There's something that needed to happen because that healing took place. Now, we may or may not ever see that this side of heaven, but that's not the point. The point is that if we see these things as gifts that are intrinsically or given to us, and we get to disperse or use at our own discretion, there's a problem with that because they're not ours. It wasn't us who did it. It was God who did it through us. And that's what Lewis is saying. And that's my argument against the whole cessationist idea that, well, people aren't empowered with these things anymore. Well, people were never empowered with them. God did the work through them. And you're going to argue semantics with me, and that's fine. We can talk about the semantic argument about it. But no tree. So think about this time when Jesus walks by the fig tree. There's no figs, and he's like, I curse you, you die. Lewis says this: no tree died that year in Palestine or any year or in any land or even ever will, save because he, God, has done something, or more likely, ceased to do something. The problem to me with cessationism is that we put the power back in the hands of humanity where it doesn't belong, and we remove it from God, which is where it does belong. So if somebody is truly speaking in tongues or speaking prophecy, they are speaking the word of God and not of themselves. So I think that there is common ground there with the cessationist in a lot of ways. But what we have to recognize is it was never, if I went and I completely healed my dog's leg after he just had surgery, I didn't do that. I was a vessel used by God to perform that healing, and there was a reason that God allowed for that to happen. I don't know what it was, and I may never know what it is. By the way, that didn't happen. But and Lewis, even he says, look, I can understand the man who denies the miraculous altogether, and this is a problem that I have too. But what is one to make of the people who admit some miracles but deny, and he uses specifically the virgin birth. And this is kind of the argument that I make, right? We go through and we read the Bible, and there are things that only can take place through supernatural intervention, miraculous things that have taken place. And some of those things we're okay with. Others we're not. So like Lewis's question and my question is, who are we to get to choose what things are possible and what things are not? God is the one that gets... If it happened, it happened. And our discomfort with it doesn't change anything about that. And he's talking about the virgin birth. And like, there's all these things that go into the virgin birth. I'm not going to belabor us with all of those things, but Lewis's whole point in the next sort of 2 paragraphs is essentially, what's not miraculous about human reproduction? Like, what is not miraculous about how humans reproduce? And frankly, most reproduction, what's not miraculous about reproduction? Right? But we don't see that part, right? Because we can explain it. We can grasp it. We can hold in our hands the fact that when a man and a woman have sexual intercourse, the sperm meets the egg and it starts to divide, and it's only ever going to become a human. There's no question about that. Biology is not, this isn't a clump of cells issue. Maybe it technically at some point is a clump of cells, but it's also only ever going to be a human. It's a human. It is what it is. And I'm not going to argue with somebody about that, about the whole clump of cells thing, because the issue is settled by science. Sperm meets egg, human. How do we know that the pro-life side of things has won the argument, the scientific argument? It's very simple. No longer do serious people with serious arguments argue whether or not it's a human. It is human. What do they argue? They argue whether or not it's a person, right? So they've taken it out of the objective and put it into the subjective so that we can have an argument that actually means nothing. It's a worthless argument. Do not imagine, and this is Lewis again, do not imagine that I'm trying to make the miracles less miraculous. I'm not arguing that they are more probable because they are less unlike natural events. I'm trying to answer those who think them arbitrary, theatrical, or unworthy of God, meaningless interruptions of universal order. They remain, in my view, wholly miraculous. And I share this, frankly, I share this view with Lewis. All of these things are miraculous. They are miracles. It is a miracle that these things happen. So for us to say, and look, we can go back to the pro-life conversation and argument. You'd be hard-pressed to find a biblical Christian who wouldn't say that every life is a miracle. Even cessationists will go, that's miraculous. Well, is God doing miracles or not? Right? Because what it boils down to is our comfort level above everything. And that's the problem with modern, certainly Western Christianity, is there are things that we will not lean into or things that we will lean away from, not because they are true or untrue, but because of our comfort level with those things. And that's problematic because an unbelieving world will look at us and go, well, doesn't the Bible say yes? Well, yeah, but it's a little bit complicated, and here's why it's complicated. And really the explanation is not biblical. It's just the fact that I'm too small-minded to recognize, or I'm too insecure to deal with the fact that this thing is what it is. Look, I'm starting to get a little frustrated here. And maybe you can see that on my face. I don't know. You can hear it in my voice. But the fact that we don't like something doesn't make it true or untrue. There are things within the Bible. The sheer level, and I've talked about this before, the sheer level of mental gymnastics that is done by people, smart people in seminaries with doctorates, to say that the sons of God in Genesis 6 is something other than heavenly beings who rebelled against God to come to earth and have relationships with human women. It can't be that. It has to be the sons of Seth. Why is it then that in every other instance, in context, the same context, the B'nai Elohim means heavenly beings? It means beings that are outside of our understanding of the natural order. But here, because we don't like the idea that angels can sin, because we don't like the idea that they could lust, because it messes with our idea of what angels are, or these B'nai Elohim, these sons of God, it messes with our idea of what they are. We don't know what they are anyway. We have no idea what they are anyway. You look at the descriptions of like the seraphim throughout the Old Testament, and those things are scary as crap. But there's lots of evidence that some sort of angelic beings show up walking around eating food throughout the Old Testament. But God forbid that, like we think about this, okay? From a theological standpoint, we have a belief that before Adam and Eve were put on the earth, there was some sort of bad thing that happened, some sort of rebellion that happened in the heavenly places that we don't know all about. We don't. And even the places where we're given a window into it, i.e. the book of Enoch, people are like, don't trust Enoch. Don't trust Enoch. Like, there's lots of parts of Enoch that we shouldn't trust. But there's also parts that like are quoted by the New Testament, i.e. Peter and Jude, and that were found along with the rest of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'm sorry that you're just uncomfortable with that. I'm not saying it should be canon, but they quoted it, which means it was a part of their worldview. It was a part of their theological view of Christianity. I'm sorry you don't like it. It doesn't make it untrue. That's the whole point here. And when we start to form our theology based off of the things that we can comprehend in our tiny little minds, then people who are not believers in Christ see that, they read the Bible, they go, you're not practicing what this says, and you're trying to explain away something that actually looks pretty clear in the text. I don't want to have anything to do with you. We are affecting the eternity of people because our tiny little brains have to be right and we can't figure it out. Like, you want to be that guy? Do you want to be that guy? Because I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be the guy that Jesus is like, hey, remember when I said, if you force any one of these little ones away from me, like it's going to be really bad? You're that guy. I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be that guy because I'm uncomfortable with the truth in the Bible. Like, get over it. Get over it. The people who are out there screaming at Michael Heiser because they don't like that he was like, there's a council based off of the original text and what this says in the context of all of it. And they're like, well, here's all the reasons Michael Heiser was wrong. It's real easy to armchair quarterback when the guy's dead. And it's not like his research. It's not like the things that he looked at and said and understood from the original text is terribly complicated. It actually only gets complicated when you're like, I want to say they were the sons of Seth because I don't want angels to have lusted and have man parts and be able to have babies with women. Grow up. Like, grow up. Because people's eternity can absolutely be affected by that. Especially in a time when we have an enemy that recognizes that this is a spiritual battle and is leaning into it. And why is he leaning into it? He's leaning into it because the church is leaning away from it. So cut it out. Sorry. Lewis says, the transfiguration and the walking on water are glimpses of the beauty and the effortless power over all matter, which will belong to men when they are really waked by God. Now, that's a lot to unpack. I don't exactly know what that means. I don't know that I believe that that means that at some point while we are in these bodies, our pre-resurrection bodies, that we will have the ability to walk on water and do all of these things. I'm not sure that I think Lewis is necessarily saying that. I know there are people walking in this earth that are saying that about Jesus. And this goes right back to my little rant just a few seconds ago, is that people are claiming that that's the case, that we can be like God. That was the original lie, wasn't it? Right? We want to get caught up in, well, was it Adam or was it Eve? The original lie was, you eat from this tree and you can be like the gods. That was the original lie. And for those of you who want to blame Eve, this is not a feminist statement. It's just the truth. Adam stood there and watched it. In that moment, dude was weak. He was like, I'm going to see what happens to you. Oh, you ate the fruit and you didn't die? Okay, I'll give me some. I'll give it a try now. Weakness. It is what it is. Deal with it. It's not feminist to say that. She took the fruit, she ate from the tree, and Adam watched her do it like a coward. In that moment, I'm not saying Adam was a coward, like for his entire life, Adam was a coward. In that moment, he was a coward. It is what it is, because he was human and he wasn't perfect, because the only perfect human to ever walk the earth was also fully God, Jesus Christ. Okay? Now, I'm going to get into some of the more complicated wording that Lewis uses here, but I think it's important to kind of recognize this and try to land this plane a little bit before I get more angry. For of course, if we cannot see why a thing is so, then we cannot see any reason why it should not be otherwise. But in fact, the actual course of nature is wholly inexplicable. I don't mean that science has not yet explained it, but may do someday. I mean that the very nature of explanation makes it impossible that we should even explain why matter has the properties it has. For explanation by its very nature deals with a word of ifs and ands. Every explanation takes the form of since A, therefore B, or if C, then D. In order to explain any event, you have to assume the universe as a going concern, a machine working in a particular way. Since this particular way of working is the basis of all explanation, it can never be itself explained. We can see no reason why it should have not worked a different way. We're just not smart enough, kids. We're just not smart enough. All of these things are miraculous because they were done by a creator who we could never possibly understand. And if we can't grasp that those things are still happening, that the spiritual world, which would seem miraculous, and a lot of the things that happen in a spiritual space are miracles to our tiny little natural brains, this is the danger of cessationism. The danger is that we don't recognize that there are things that happen that we cannot possibly comprehend. And then we push those off. And then we forget about what Paul says in Ephesians 6:10. We do not wrestle with flesh and blood. Period. It's not flesh and blood. It's all these powers that we can't see or understand or even really battle with the implements of war that we currently have. So it becomes really challenging for us to put ourselves in a position to claim things that we can't possibly know. And in so doing, we ignore that people do see things that don't make sense to them. And they're like, I'm willing to accept that this thing happened, this thing is going on, that it is what it is. And because the church can't, in some spaces, grasp these things, what happens is those people don't find answers to their questions within the church, which is where they should be finding the answers to those questions. If we just say, because here's the problem. If miracles stopped, if prophecy is, if these things have all stopped, right? And look, I'm not going all in for prophecy is still happening or speaking in tongues is or isn't happening. We already talked about the gift of apostleship, which I don't think is the gift of apostleship. It's the gift of discipleship and evangelism. Like, if we stop and ignore that miraculous things, miracles can happen today, then we believe that everything else can be explained away in some sort of a natural way or a natural order. And in so doing, we discount the experiences that these people are really and truly having that are spiritual in nature, and we try to turn them into something that's not actually spiritual in nature because we don't want to acknowledge that spiritual warfare is actually happening, because that takes power away from us and we can't do the thing. And here in America, we can do anything we put our minds to, but just lift yourself up by your bootstraps or whatever the stupid thing is, and I can do it. I can do it on my own. Look, we have to recognize in the West, we live better than 90% of the rest of the world. And those people are not idiots because they're not rich. That just came to me. I'm going to say it again. People in poorer parts of the world are not idiots because they're not rich. I mean, seriously, kids. We've got to do better. We've got to be smarter. We've got to recognize that there are things that are outside of our control. We've got to recognize that God wants us reliant on Him, not on a bottle or a shot or whatever the thing is. And everything that we do that erodes away the idea that God can and will do miraculous things. Like, I don't know that I believe that God's not performing miracles because we don't wholeheartedly have faith that He can do it. I don't know if I buy that. I don't know. Like, I'm not saying, I don't know. I probably don't. I'm saying I have no idea. But just ask yourself the question, what if, like, legitimately, what if God is not doing miraculous things or performing miracles in your life because you don't really truly believe he can, or you don't really truly believe He would, or you're not really truly dependent on Him in a way that you should be dependent on Him. And like here's the vulnerability. That's where I'm at, man. I struggled to get this up and going, partially because I'm trying to get my business up and running, and that's just a crap ton of work. But also, like, it's just a hard time in our lives, and there's a lot going on, and there are a lot of miracles that I wish God would just show up and do. And maybe He will. And maybe I'm just afraid to look too closely at it, because what if He doesn't? I'm not God. You're not God. Let's quit pretending that we know what He's doing or isn't doing or whatever the thing is. Let's just settle into the fact that He is working all things for our good, not for our comfort. That, as cliche as it may be, smooth seas do not make a good sailor. Like, we got to go through hell sometimes to really to level up. And that's where I feel like I'm at. Like, you ever play a video game and you're like on the boss level, and you know, like, once you get through this, you're going to level up. Once you beat this one boss, you're going to level up to the next level and unlock all kinds of other skills and things that you can do. Like, that's where I feel like I'm at in my life right now. But if we have it all figured out, if we can do it all on our own, then there never really is a boss level. Because at the end of the day, there are very few people who can beat the boss level all on their own. That's where the video game analogy really just breaks down. We need help. And it's through the community of the church that I think the best help comes. It's broken and it's flawed, but it's the best help that there is. So, look, that's it. That's it for miracles. I think that miracles have to continue. I think that they are happening. I know they're happening in third world countries, and I don't think that those people are stupid because they're poor. I think that, if anything, we're ignorant, maybe even willfully ignorant, because we are comparatively rich. And some of you may hate me for saying that, and that's fine. We can have a conversation about it. You can ask me some questions, but it is what it is. Hey, look, check out the description below. I don't know. There may be an email where you can email me questions and really be pissed off at me coming, but expect that hopefully in the future that these things are going to be video and audio. I'm going to go back and into the YouTubes and add all of the previous episodes to YouTube so you can listen to them on there, and we can have some fun with that. But look, be safe out there, have fun. God does really awesome stuff, and just get out of your own way of seeing how God is an amazing God and does amazing things. Ask questions. Ask questions. There should be nobody telling you can't ask questions. Ask the questions and get somebody to give you answers, and let's rock and roll. Let's do this thing. Once again, Glendalough Pot Still Irish Whiskey. I'm in there with it. Let's do that. Sláinte. Have a great rest of your day. And yeah, this is, I guess, peace out from Jesus Whiskey and question marks.